Ash is a Pokemon trainer who has traveled and caught a lot of Pokemon, more specifically fire-type Pokemon. So it got me thinking, which one of Ash's fire-type Pokemon is the strongest? At first glance, I thought it would be extremely easy to rank them, but the more I looked into it, the more difficult it was to actually rank their strengths, since most of them are the ace of their own respective team, and for some reason a lot of them seem to have messed up backstories. No, seriously, Charmander was abused and abandoned by his old trainer for being weak, but Tepig and Chimchar might as well join the club and all go to group therapy since they have the exact same backstory. Ash's Litten had dead parents, and Cyndaquil had a pretty nice life. Regardless, this built them up to be the strong Pokemon that they are today, but it was pretty difficult picking between Ash's 7 fire-type Pokemon on who's the strongest out of Charizard, Quilava, Torkoal, Infernape, Pignite, Talonflame, and Incineroar, but it certainly wasn't hard picking who the weakest was, and unfortunately we'll have to start off this list by picking one of the most obvious choices ever, Torkoal. Is what I would have said before doing research for this video. Yes, at first glance, Torkoal does have one of the worst win rates of Ash's Pokemon ever, and he was just straight up annoying throughout the Hoenn season, but he isn't actually the worst. That spot has to go to Quilava. Now look, I love Quilava just as much as the next guy, but looking at the feats, it's not even close, or more like the non-existent feats that this Pokemon has. When Ash first went to the Johto region in the Pokemon anime, he ended up encountering Cyndaquil, and it was going to be a pretty good addition to his team, considering a few episodes ago, Ash just lost Charizard. Little did Ash know though that Cyndaquil was very weak and lazy. He literally needed to charge himself up to even be able to use moves like Flamethrower. When Ash went ahead and used Cyndaquil against Bugsy, the bug-type gym leader, Cyndaquil was too sleepy to even fight and was just lazy, so Ash had to return him. Yes, in the end, Cyndaquil did come back and was able to defeat Bugsy's Scyther, but is that really a big accomplishment? That is the bare minimum and something I'd expect from any one of Ash's fire types. Granted, Cyndaquil didn't act like this forever. Against the 7th gym leader, Price, Cyndaquil was actually very useful, and this is probably one of his best feats, where he went up against Price's Dewgong. This was the most locked in I've ever seen this Pokemon, because even when Cyndaquil got put into ice, he used the flames on his back to melt it. He dodged Dewgong's Aurora Beam and even shot a flamethrower straight at Dewgong without any hesitation. And when Dewgong went into the water, Cyndaquil did not care because he jumped right into the water, used Swift, and then he became Aquaman for a minute because he was standing on top of the water shooting flamethrowers at Dewgong, defeating him in his own territory. If Cyndaquil did more stuff like this, he definitely would be ranked higher, but the next memorable thing he did besides just competing in the Johto League was evolving into Quilava, and that was in the Sinnoh season. When Ash was training for the Sinnoh League and brought out all his old Pokemon, Team Rocket pulled up and did their usual shenanigans, and Cyndaquil ended up evolving into Quilava to save his friends and learned Eruption. But Ash's Pokemon evolving because of Team Rocket really isn't something special because everybody basically does that. Quilava's had a whopping total of 1 battle, and that was in the Sinnoh League where he just drawed with the Artiodose, which is one of the primary reasons why I had to put him into dead last, since he has very little battle experience. And just to get the elephant in the room out of the way, he is one of the only fire type Pokemon of Ash's to not be fully evolved. Not to pull that card, but it would be pretty helpful if we had a Typhlosion instead of a Quilava. But unfortunately, Quilava is not the only offender of not being fully evolved, because for our 6th place we have Ash's Pignite. With Pignite, I really don't know what went wrong. He had the perfect formula for success to being a strong fire-type Pokemon on Ash's team, having a tragic backstory, getting saved by Ash, and then coming back many episodes later to defeat the abusive trainer. I'd even argue that Tepig probably had it one of the hardest, since his trainer literally tied him to a pole to abandon him. When Ash added Tepig onto the team, he was pretty useful, and his story arc led up to him defeating his old trainer and evolving in that fight. Then Pignite kind of did nothing afterwards. The only notable battle that he really has is against a Hydreigon, which he was able to KO, and then Pignite just versus a bunch of fodder for the rest of the Black and White series. But I don't entirely blame Pignite for not reaching his full potential, since the Pokemon Company said the Unova season was supposed to be a soft reboot of the franchise, and it's pretty clear since Ash chose to evolve less than half of his team this season. So I'm sorry Pignite, you kinda just got dealt a trash hand. But for the rest of the Pokemon on this list, I would consider them actually really strong. From here on out, they they are all fully evolved and have some serious battling experience. And for 5th place, I would have to place none other than Talonflame. Yes, I know it's a shocker that this bird is placed lower than Torkoal, but trust me, there's a good reason for it. In Pokemon X and Y, Talonflame was the regional bird that Ash caught. As a fletchling, it was always pretty useful, and it was even able to fight up against another Talonflame at such a young evolution stage. In this battle, Fletchling was able to evolve into Fletchinder and defeat the Talonflame, so it really proved the amount of potential it had. I would easily say though that the best thing this Pokemon does that puts it in a far above tier than the last 2 candidates was go up against Moltres. Moltres was going absolutely crazy against Ash and the gang, and Fletchinder was holding his own, and it got so bad to the point where Moltres threw a fire blast straight at Ash trying to kill them, but Fletchinder absorbed the fire and evolved into Talonflame. As a Talonflame, he is no joke because he was able to get a few good Brave Birds off on Moltres, and even though in the end Talonflame ended up losing, but it's still pretty impressive that Talonflame was able to hold their own. One of the more impressive things it did as a Talonflame was able to defeat Wulfric's Avalugg. And probably one of the hardest battles it had was near the end of the series against Lysander's Mega Gyarados, and even though Talonflame ended up losing it, it put up a pretty good fight. With all that being said and done, we are now in the top half of Ash's Fire-type Pokemon, and the Pokemon in 4th place, I would honestly have to say it's Torkoal. Now look, I'm just as shocked as you, with the Pokemon having less than a 50% win rate, being one of the worst on his own team, not even wanting to fight half of the time, and having one of the most mediocre stats and movesets. What could possibly place this Pokemon in the top 4? And it's one main thing he does that almost no other Pokemon has done. In the Battle Frontier, Ash uses Torkoal against Brendan's Registeel, and Torkoal put up an amazing fight. You would think this Pokemon is Zenitsu because he was a completely different person this fight, evading a bunch of attacks, using Body Slam left and right, being very smart with his moves. Then when Registeel went ahead and used Sandstorm, Torkoal set it on fire, masking his presence, jumping over it. Then he used the power of the Sandstorm, the fire and the tornado, and the weight of Torkoal to use Body Slam on top of the Registeel. Registeel was genuinely on the verge of losing, and if it wasn't for Registeel using Lock On and getting a final sneak attack on Torkoal, he would have won the battle. But in the end, Torkoal ended up getting knocked down first, but Registeel was gravely injured. And comparing this battle to Ash's Talonflame versus a Moltres, Torkoal put up a much better fight. And granted, just to add on to Torkoal's resume, he technically did go up against a Darkrai in the Sinnoh League against Tobias, but to call this much of a fight was a bit of an understatement. But if Torkoal was a university student looking for an internship, I could exaggerate it and say Torkoal was able to hold his own in a highly stressful situation against a mythical Pokemon. There is one thing Ash's Torkoal could have done to become his strongest Fire-type Pokemon yet, and that would be hitting the subscribe button. I hear it gives you some sort of buff, and the button's down below, so try it out. We're getting super close to my goal of 100k, and it would mean the world if you join us on this journey. Now we finally made it to the top 3. If there was going to be an honorable mention section, I would have to put in Gengar, since he's basically the spiritual successor to Ash's Fire-type Pokemon in Pokemon Journeys, since all of Ash's Fire-type Pokemon mentored Gengar into learning new Fire-type moves. But now we move on to the Pokemon who I think is the 3rd strongest of Ash's Fire-type Pokemon, and that would be Incineroar. In the Alola season when Ash caught Litten, he was pretty powerful and always had a fighting spirit. This Litten ended up having a rivalry against Professor Kukui's Incineroar. One day when they were battling, this Incineroar pushed Litten so far that he evolved into Torracat. And let me just tell you, this Torracat was an absolute beast, having one of the best win rates in the Alola season. Being at around 70%, this Torracat always seemed to clutch up. One of the greatest feats this Pokemon seemed to have is in the Alola Pokemon League, where he went up against Professor Kukui's Incineroar at full power. I made a full video breaking it down on my channel, and this is honestly one of the coolest fights in the Pokemon franchise, but everything was on the line here. This Incineroar was easily the ace of Kukui's team and the strongest in the entire room, and ultimately in the end, this Incineroar ended up losing to its pre-evolution Torracat. With all that being said, if Torracat was going this crazy in its second form, I wonder how strong it would be as an Incineroar. After Torracat finally defeated its rival, it evolved into the oh-so-powerful Incineroar. A Pokemon so powerful, I believe it has the power to rival and surpass Charizard and Infernape, so why is it in 3rd place? Well, there's one major issue about Ash's Incineroar. We know literally nothing about this Pokemon. I'm not kidding. The minute this Incineroar evolved, the Pokemon Sun and Moon anime ended, and he never fought once. If you had any hope about seeing him in Pokemon Journeys, well, we did see him. He just didn't fight. He just had a few nice cameos. I honestly believe this is one of Ash's Pokemon that was robbed the most, because he was so powerful as a Torracat. Just imagine what he can do as an Incineroar. Charmeleon and Monferno weren't that strong in their second stages, and they got crazy boosts in their third stage, so I guess we'll never know how strong this cat would be. It really is a shame, because Incineroar is one of my favorite Pokemon, and I was excited to see him in the anime, but I guess one can dream. Now we are down to the final two, undoubtedly Ash's two strongest fire-type Pokemon, and the ones people seem to love the most, Ash's Infernape and Ash's Charizard. I'm going to be taking a look at their feats simultaneously since they seem to be pretty similar. Both these Pokemon were abused and abandoned by their trainers. Charmander was the first fire-type Pokemon that Ash had, and throughout that journey, he had a lot of emotional and physical ups and downs. I made a whole video breaking down Charizard's character arcs if you want to check that out, but the moral of the story is by the end of that season, he evolved into a Charizard and wanted to be the very strongest Charizard once he went to the Charcific Valley and realized that there are so many more powerful lizards than him. When Ash met Infernape, he was a Chimchar and he was being abandoned by Paul since Paul viewed him as weak and was just completely abusing him. When Ash added Infernape onto his team, he had major anger issues. This Pokemon's trump card was its ability Blaze, where when he gets to low HP, he gets super powerful, but it's not like a regular Blaze because this Infernape goes Super Saiyan anytime it happens, crashing out, seeing red, and almost winning any battle when this ability activates. I would go more in depth on why this is happening, but I promise you I'm making a full video on Infernape sooner rather than later, so make sure you're subscribed for that. Overall, by the end of the Sinnoh League, Infernape ended up beating Paul and finishing that character arc. But Infernape's journey doesn't end there. His greatest feat has to be in Pokemon Journeys, where he versus Moltres and holds his own. This Pokemon wasn't even breaking a sweat, and if it wasn't for Gary jumping in and just making Infernape lose more of his spotlight since it seemed like he needed help, I believe Infernape had the power to solo this legendary Pokemon. Professor Oak even tells us that after Ash left Infernape behind, he never stopped training and even challenged all of Ash's fire-type Pokemon to a battle and even had a 1v1 against Charizard, but we never found out who the winner of that was. Normally with all this, I would probably place Infernape over Charizard, except Charizard actually does have legendary Pokemon experience. He ended up versing Articuno. In a 1v1 against Nolan's Articuno, Ash used Charizard and they had a fully uninterrupted 1v1. And unlike all the previous Pokemon on this list that have versed legendary Pokemon, Charizard actually won and lived to tell the tale. Even if I were to assume that Infernape would have beat Moltres in a 1v1, unfortunately I have to pull this card. Charizard just has the type advantage. Some people seem to forget, but Charizard is not a dragon type. He is a fire flying type, and Infernape is a fire fighting type. Fighting is weak to flying. So unless Infernape was just so much drastically stronger than Charizard, it's pretty safe to assume that Charizard is the stronger Pokemon. I know it's a bit of a boring answer to just place Charizard in first place, but if you actually look at everything, Charizard is Ash's best fire type Pokemon. With all that being said, strength certainly isn't everything, so if you want to know how Charizard or Incineroar rose from their absolutely tragic backstories, click one of the two videos on your screen because I think you'll really enjoy it. So, I'll catch you all next week.